Happy Saturday night. So glad to have you join us tonight. Tonight's message is from last Sunday. So you can still interact with us, send us a message. In fact, at the end of this message, send an email to our pastor on what God showed you through this. And remember that tomorrow morning, which is Sunday, we have our on-campus worship at 9:30 and 11. And tomorrow online, you can watch us at 9:30, 11, and 8 p.m. Look forward to seeing you on our campus or online this next week.
My name is Elliott Higgins. I am the executive pastor here at Southcliff. I'm with you this month. Our senior pastor, Dr. Moore, is out this month, taking some time not only be with his family, and he's going to work some vacation in there, but he is praying through so many things, and he's going to come back. And my prayer, and what I would encourage you to pray with us about, is that the Lord just gives him a word like never before. And when he comes back and leads our staff, that we are in line with God's vision and we see him move and his kingdom come. So be praying for him as he's out. Now, as I mentioned, I'm with you for this month, and we are talking about your favorite subject, anxiety. So glad that you are here. But each week, we are looking at a different passage of Scripture where God is addressing the subject of anxiety. Now, many of us in the room, there seems to be some kind of a stigma, as it were, as far as what anxiety is. Some will be wrestling with this in a huge way, so much so that it is so hard to get out of bed, or you wake up and you are so worried about what is about to be. But at the end of the day, what God is giving us today is a very clear picture of what he wants anxiety to be in your life. He does not want you to live a life filled and overflowing with anxiousness. That is not his design and his purpose. And I sincerely believe that that is why he has brought you here today. Even if you're joining us online, it matters not. God put this problem in your life, the one that you brought with you today. Whatever that is that's causing stress as it comes to the forefront of your mind, God brought that into your life at the same time he's bringing this passage here. And his design is that as soon as we are finished looking at this passage, it's a whole new day for you. Look with me, if you will, to Luke chapter 12. We're going to be in Luke chapter 12. Now, what I believe God is doing in our time together is he is taking this anxiety and he is going to refocus that to assurance. We're moving from anxiety to assurance, or anxiety to confidence, anxiety to peace. My question for you today is, what is the thing in your life that is causing you the most stress and anxiousness and even despair? What is that problem? Because what I believe God's going to do in the pages before us today, Jesus himself is addressing anxiety. What he's going to do is the very first part, if we split this into three parts, the first part, Jesus is giving us a perspective of anxiety. This perspective is a God perspective. You and I, when we're looking at our problem, we're fixated on that. We're trying to control it. We're trying to move it from one way to the other. But God is giving us a whole different perspective, and it gives us a clear view of what anxiety really is and what God's intention for this is. Then he gives us two critical things after that. The first part is this view of anxiety and what we need to be doing with it. But then he gives us two key elements that allows us to shift from anxiety to assurance. I am convinced that there is not a single person that wakes up in the morning, walks outside, it's a beautiful breeze blowing, all the flowers are blooming, the birds are chirping, you look up and there's white poofy clouds are floating by, it is a gorgeous day. I think that I am going to be a nervous wreck today. Nobody does that. I love looking at the sunrise. It's got that nice golden red hue on those clouds. And I look at that and say, I want to be anxious today, up to my eyeballs where I can barely breathe even. Nobody wants that. But many of us live in that kind of a reality. When something shows up in our life, we lose sleep over it. We do not want to eat our food. We are now short with our family and our wife and our spouse, our children. We deal with things differently when anxiety comes into our life. So here's what we're going to do. Look with me at Luke chapter 12. We're going to begin in verse 22. What we're going to do, this is divided really into three parts. This first part, Jesus is addressing anxiety, specifically giving us God's perspective of this. And it's allowing us to see anxiety for what it is. All right? So let's read this together. We're going to work verse by verse through this text. Verse 22. And he said to his disciples, this is Jesus, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. I'm going to pause here for a second. Jesus begins this whole thing by making it abundantly clear the command or what God is expecting of anxiety. Very specifically, he says, do not be anxious. That's the command. God's design for your life is that you are not filled with anxiety. God's command is that this anxiety needs to move out of your life. God's plan and purpose for you is that anxiousness is not attached to the core of who you are. He begins by giving us this standard. Now, here's the deal. That is super easy to preach. Don't be anxious. But many of you, myself included, say, well, that's great. I wish that would be the case. I really don't want to be anxious, but here's the problem. Every one of the problems that's making me anxious, the reality is I cannot change this problem. I feel like a leaf in the wind. I am really along for the ride. I feel helpless to change this. I cannot make it go left or right or go away. So you're telling me that your design is that I'm not anxious. What in the world do I do about it? Well, Jesus tells us, don't be anxious. It's not God's plan for that. And here's what he does next. He says, don't be anxious about your life, what you're going to eat, nor about your body, what you're going to put on. And he says this, for life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing. What you eat is, in fact, important. And what we're seeing develop here is Jesus is addressing ancient Jews. But he's also addressing every man, woman, and child on the face of the earth. He is going back to a lowest common denominator of what we need. We recognize that every one of us, we have to eat. If we are going to live, food has to be part of it. In some countries, we are concerned or anxious about the color of carpet that we're putting in our house. But if you get down to it, it doesn't matter what level you're at. The bottom line is, if you do not have food, you're not going to care about anything else. This is a basic thing that no matter who you are, what culture you're from, Jesus is trying to bring this down to the most basic survival element. We know that we need food, and he says, do not be anxious about this. We also know that we need clothing. If we go out without proper clothing, it is possible in some cases that we will surely die, just like if we don't eat. At the very least, if we are not dressed appropriately, we are not going to be able to function in society. All of this is extremely important, but Jesus is saying, do not be anxious about that. Why? How is it that these things are critical for my survival and you say don't worry about it? This is where many people will divorce from this scripture. And they'll say, this is too spiritual. God's out here, and this is physical. How is it that I'm supposed to forget about the very physical existence and the needs that I have? How do I go about doing that? Well, let me elaborate on this. He's saying that whatever this is, the food that you eat, he says very specifically that your life is more than food. The problem that you are fixated on, this concept of eating, your life is much bigger than whatever it is that you eat. There's more going on here, and you are failing to recognize that because you are so focused on this one issue. Let me give you a little bigger picture with that. When he is saying that this issue is small in comparison, your life is much bigger than this issue, you may not realize it, but every second that the clock ticks by, your body replicates 3.8 million new cells. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Every time that happens, 3.8 million new cells. Over the course of the day, that's 330 billion brand new cells. From your liver to your brain to your arteries, it makes no difference what it is. The reality is you have to have these cells replicating all of your body on time and properly every second of your life. Do you have anything to do with that? Are you in some way in control of which cell is replicating and when? These are things that you need to have in order to live. And God's saying you're fixated on only one thing, what you eat. But there's so many other things that are taking place right now that is guarding your life and allowing you to live. I have asthma, so a good deep breath sometimes is very much of a blessing. I enjoy that. But what you may not recognize is every breath that you breathe, just a normal breath, there is 1.5 trillion oxygen molecules that your lungs absorb and move into your bloodstream. Literally every breath. Jesus is saying that your life is so much bigger than any food that you're putting into your body. Your life is bigger than that. There is more going on, and God is orchestrating this whole thing, and you don't even see it. We're fixated on one thing only, and your body is more than the piece of fabric you put over the top of it. There's so much more that God is doing. Do not fixate on that. Let me say this. What Jesus is telling us, do not be anxious, but no matter what your problem is, your life is of much greater value than any problem that comes in it. Does not matter what problem that you have with you today, it is small in comparison to the breadth of what your life brings. I don't know what story you have, but there may be someone here that is looking out at whatever that problem is. You're saying, I have no hope here. I do not see a future. I don't think that I can even go on. Jesus is saying that whatever that problem is so minuscule compared to the value of your life. It never will measure up to that. Don't be anxious about this. You're fixated on it. Stop doing that. Watch. He continues. There's more going on than what you think. Verse 24. He's given us this statement, and he says, consider the ravens. I'm going to pause here for a second. He's just given us God's command. Do not be anxious. There is more going on. There's more going on with your life than just food. There's more going on than just clothing. There's so much more. Don't worry about this stuff. God's working out bigger things. I want to shift your attention to look at the ravens. Now, ravens, this is Elliott Higgins terminology, I guess. Ravens are nasty birds. Dirty, nasty birds. I'm sure I'm going to get an email in the morning of 10 reasons why ravens are no beautiful creation. That's fine, but they're still nasty birds. They eat grain, they eat bugs, they do all of this stuff, but what makes them nasty, they eat dead things. So Jesus is turning our attention. Remember, his audience at the moment is the ancient Israelites. In the raven to them, God has already told them, this is unclean. You do not touch these. You do not keep them as a pet. They are not kosher. You do not eat them. They are dirty birds. They're nasty. They eat dead stuff. Doesn't matter if it's been dead for a week. They're feasting on this stuff. They're disgusting. So he's saying, listen, do not be anxious about the food or the clothing, but I want you to look at these dirty birds. They neither sow nor reap. They're not out there working, hustling, getting together a posse to go out and work the farmland. They're not doing that. They don't have storehouse or barn. They're not planning ahead. They're not thinking about how they can make their life better. These nasty birds are just going about their business, doing what God created them to do. And he says this, and yet God feeds them. How much of more value are you than these birds? It's as if Jesus is taking their attention. He's saying, I don't want you to be anxious. There's more going on than just the food. There's more going on than the clothing. I know these are the basic common denominators of your life, but I want you to look at something that's very much on the periphery. These are not animals that you look up to. They're not animals that you want to keep as a pet. You can't eat them. You touch them, you're unclean. They've got bacteria and virus. These animals, even though they are on the far fringe of the animal kingdom, God provides for them. And if he's doing that for something as lowly as this, what do you think he's doing for someone whom he sent his son from heaven to die on the cross to redeem you? And not just to redeem you as if we walk into heaven and say, this is great. He has literally said that he has elevated us even into positions of authority in heaven. So all of this, he is moving all of the forces of heaven. God's full attention is on humanity. But yet he takes care of these ravens. What do you think his plan and purpose is for your life? Your life is so much bigger than any problem that shows up. Your life is of such great value that there is not a single problem that makes any difference with what God is trying to do and what God is accomplishing in your life. So he's reminding them, look at that, the lowest of these birds, you don't want to be near them, but he is bringing about this restoration. And then he continues in verse 25, which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to your span of life? Now he's beginning to really get to the meat of this first section. How can you add a single hour? If you cannot do something as small as this thing, why are you anxious about the rest? With all of the anxiety and all of the challenges that he is bringing out to us, anxiety does not change even an hour of your life. So if it does not change that, why are we concerned about this other issue? Easy enough to preach, but let me show you what this looks like in reality. If this table can represent your life, I recognize that there are problems that have walked into this room. There are problems that are at home, and let me just bring up a few of them here. So the first one, maybe we're going to work, our boss is crazy. You may have a crazy boss, or maybe you've worked for one, but here's a 10-pound weight. This represents the anxiety that I have when I go to work. My boss does not like me. This is a toxic work environment. I get anxious every time I wake up in the morning. I'm going to have to go to work. I'm going to have to deal with this person. I can't tell whether I'm on the right side or the left any waking minute. If I breathe crooked, I feel like he's going to try to fire me. This is a legitimate problem. Nobody's denying that, not even God. He recognizes that, and he knows the stress that it brings. It is a weight. There it is. That's the problem. But that's not your only problem. That's 10 pounds. You've got to carry that. But there's something even bigger in your life. For some of you, this may be different, but you may have just been diagnosed with something that you never thought you would be diagnosed with. There may be a loss of a loved one, and now all of a sudden you've got 50 pounds problem. This is a big problem compared to that, but I'm still having to carry this. I never dreamed that I would have this diagnosis. I never dreamed that I would say goodbye to this loved one so soon. I never dreamed that I have to navigate this. This is so heavy and burdensome. My boss is still crazy, but now I've got this. This is a weight in my life, and it's not going away. But it's not over yet. Many of you go home. You've done your work. You're carrying the burden of whatever this is. You go home and you've got family issues. Here's a 25-pound weight. You've got your boss. You've got a diagnosis. You've got family problems. Your marriage is coming apart. Dare I say it? Your in-laws are crazy. Whatever this may be, this is still a weight that you are carrying. What Jesus is saying here is he's saying, do not be anxious about the things of your life. The problem that you have and that walks into your life is of much greater value than any one of these things. Now, the problem that you and I have is we look at this and say, okay, I recognize that God is saying I shouldn't be anxious. But the reason why I'm anxious is because I can't control any one of these. I can't move this. I can't declare myself free of cancer. I can't seem to find another job. Trust me, I'm looking for one, but I need just the right one, the pay raise that I need, the things that I need, and maybe I'll get one soon, but I still have to put up with this for a while. There is not a tranquilizer in the world enough to take down the emotional turmoil that's going on with my in-laws. I cannot move any of these, and he is saying, what role does anxiety have in any of these things? If I'm worried about this or this or this, what does my anxiousness do with the weight? Absolutely nothing. It does not change the weight. It does not move it. It does not remove it. You cannot declare yourself free of cancer. You cannot fix your boss no matter how hard you try. There are interpersonal conflicts that you can do your best, but the other person, there's some reciprocation that has to happen. I can't fix this. That's why I'm so anxious. I am along for the ride. I feel helpless in these conditions. I do not know how this is going to turn out. I don't know what's coming next. So I am boiling over like a pot on the stove with all of this anxiety. So it leads us to this first point. You can write this down. When Jesus is saying, do not be anxious about this stuff, here's the question we have to ask ourselves. The question is, what does anxiety actually do with my problem? That's the first point. Ask how anxiety helps. If I'm anxious about the cancer diagnosis or whatever, it literally doesn't lift the weight. It doesn't change anything about this problem whatsoever. Jesus is telling us that God's design is that you don't live a life of anxiety. And if you really boil it down, anxiety does not change any of this. It does not help your problem. In fact, usually what it does is it brings about other problems. I'm so distracted by whatever these things are, I don't sleep well at night. I don't really have an appetite. I am a little short-tempered with family members, people that I love. I forget certain things because I'm so distracted by these issues, and it actually brings about other things. And Jesus is saying, look, don't worry about these things. Your worry, your anxiety doesn't actually change them. So if we're going to address anxiety, he's already put out in God's perspective, do not be anxious. And at the very end, he says that this does not impact even an hour of your life. So why do it? Now, I recognize that many of us have come with anxiety and heavy problems. Taking away anxiety does not take away the problem. So what in the world am I to do? If anxiety doesn't help me, and the whole reason why I'm anxious is because I literally cannot change this problem. I'm along for the ride. I feel helpless and vulnerable and really at the mercy of whatever comes about. And really the higher helplessness that we have, the more anxiety that tends to come about. We want to control this, and there's so many factors that we cannot control. But Jesus is telling us that your anxiety doesn't do any good anyway. What do we do from here, Lord? If your design is that we do not are anxious about anything here, and we recognize that anxiety doesn't actually help, what is it that I'm supposed to do? I still feel helpless. I still feel like I'm at the mercy of whatever this is. What do I do? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I believe that that's the exact reason why God brought you here today. And it's the exact reason why he has put this passage before us. We recognize he doesn't want you to be anxious, and anxiety doesn't do anything to lift even 1 pound off of this table, off of your shoulders of this problem. Verse 27, we continue. We recognize we're going to ask, how does anxiety help? Well, it doesn't. So Jesus continues, and he begins to give us something, an action plan. Verse 27, he says, consider the lilies and how they grow. So he's taking us back out into the field. Consider these lilies. They neither toil or spin. Here we go again. He's saying, I want you to look at this beauty, this masterpiece that God created. They are not working hard. They're not developing a plan for survival. They're not weaving their own clothes. They're not doing any of that stuff. And he says, yet I tell you, even Solomon in all of his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Solomon, at the height of the power of Israel, he is the one who built the temple. He is the one who really built that nation and made it beautiful. Other nations would come and seek the wisdom of Solomon. He was the wealthiest of all the kings. He was amazing in what he was able to accomplish. And Jesus, knowing his audience, is saying, I want you to look at what man has made. Even the most splendid of human beings does not produce the same beauty that God does out in the field. God's beauty and his purposes in all of this will always go beyond anything that man can create or make. There's nothing that we can do that rivals the beauty that God has put. So he's looking at these lilies, and he's saying that even them, they are more beautiful than anything man made. Verse 28, but if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? He's saying that God is the one who created the lilies, their beauty, their splendor, all of this, and they're here one day and gone the next. Even the smallest of what God produces is more glorious than the magnificence of what man produces. We also see that God's timetable is well beyond our own. Whatever God is doing in the life of these flowers is beyond their lifespan. He continues working his plan even beyond that. God's timing is perfect, and he's above and beyond all of these things. They're not anxious about this. And at the end, he says, "O you of little faith." Hang on to that little nugget for a minute, because that right there is something incredibly important for us as we continue. So he's taken our attention back out into this field. In verse 29, do not seek what you are to eat or what you are to drink, or be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things. Watch this. Your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. What he's saying is he's taking our attention off. He says, first of all, your anxiety accomplishes nothing. What does anxiety do to help my situation? Nothing. It does not lift a finger to change any of the problems that you're carrying with you right now. And then he takes us out and he says, even if you are able to declare yourself free from one of these things, it still does not rival the magnificence of what God's plan and purpose is here. God is going to work through that, and he ends in verse 30, your Father knows what you need. God literally knows this problem when it was going to show up in your life. He literally knew the prognosis before the doctors knew. He knows the outcome of every one of this. He knows the steps that it's going to take. He knows the interpersonal dynamics between each of these. God knows your problem before you ever did. God knows your problem, when it's going to end, how it's going to work out, which way it's going to turn, to the left or to the right. God knows that you need help in every one of these. It really begs this question. If we know that God's plan is for me not to be so burdened under anxiety, and God already knows what I need, and he knows when these problems are coming up, what do I do about that? How do I move out from anxiety to assurance? How do I move from anxiety over to confidence, or anxiety over to peace? These burdens are heavy. What do I do? It leads to the second point. You can write this one down too. The second thing is we have to reframe the problem. Reframe the problem. And here's one of the quickest ways to do that. Ask what God is going to do. Let me pick on the biggest weight right here. I recognize I've been diagnosed with cancer. I don't know how this is going to work out. I don't know about my funding. I don't know about the treatment. I don't know what's going to happen with my family after this. I don't know how that's going to... I don't know so much, so I'm so anxious with this. And I'm trying to plan, and I'm trying to think ahead, and I'm worried about how this is going to go. God knew this was coming before I did. So rather than looking at it with the lens of what's going to happen next, how's this going to work, ask the question, what is God going to do here? What is God already doing? If he knows that this problem is coming, and he knows how this is going to work out, then the question for me is, what's he doing here? Where am I headed? What plan of God is coming about through this? Because I know God already has a plan. It's something that already takes a load off of my shoulders when I know that though I feel absolutely helpless, God is not helpless. And he already has a plan for this. So if he has a plan, then my eyes are shifting. I am reframing this problem where I am literally looking for what God is doing. Now, I make this statement, and even in the core of who I am, say, man, it's awful hard to see God in the midst of something so dark. How in the world do I do this? Watch, I told you to pay attention to something that he said back in verse 28. He says, "O you of little faith." It's a bit of a bombshell. Many of us in the room will say, look, I really want to trust the Lord, but I don't know how this is going to go. What he's saying is, God knew when this problem was coming into your life before you did. He knows when it's going to leave. He knows every step of the journey. He knows every bit of that. Do you believe that, or do you not? If you do not believe that God knew this was coming into your life, if you do not believe that he has a plan and a purpose for it, if you do not believe that he knows when the ending comes, you are not trusting in the Lord. God knows what he's doing. And so long as we hang on to this ourselves and we refuse to acknowledge the fact that God is in control, we are going to sink in our anxiety. We have to reframe the problem and begin looking, God, what are you doing here? How are you moving with this problem? And I guarantee you that he is. And I am confident that the longer that I have lived, the more I have seen God do random things that I never anticipated. There are problems that I was worried about that never came true. In fact, I had someone tell me this week, they're like, look, I happen to think that anxiety and worry are very effective because everything I worry about never actually happens. And that's honestly very true. God knows when it arrives. He knows when it's going to go. He knows what he's teaching you through it. He knows the steps he's going to take. He never leaves nor forsakes you. God knows what he's doing. We have to reframe this if we want to live free of anxiety. Move this frame to God. I don't like this problem. You know that I don't like it. It says that you know what I need. I don't like this. I don't know what's coming, but I know that you do. So I'm going to ask, what are you doing here? And I'm going to ask that every morning when I get up. What are you doing? How are you moving in this? What is it about your kingdom that you're bringing about? And he's saying as soon as we are seeking his kingdom, when we're watching for him, he answers these things. You're going to see him because God is not aloof. He's not removed. He's engaged into these problems. He knew they were coming. He knows what's going on. He's got that. All right. So if anxiety doesn't help me and I've got to reframe my problem and look at it from God's perspective, what is God doing? What else do I do? This is still heavy. So let's look and continue to look here in verse 32. Jesus begins to summarize this. If we know anxiety doesn't work, and we know that if I reframe the problem, I'm going to see the Lord and it's going to take this anxiety off, he continues and says, verse 32, "Fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. And he continues from there, but I'm going to pause for a second. It is God's good pleasure. The Father is the one who is in heaven. Jesus is speaking this. He says everything, the fullness of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, everything here is coming to bear on this problem. It is God's good pleasure to bring the kingdom. And literally it says to give you the kingdom. And the word pleasure there, that God's heart delights in giving this. It's what I said at the beginning. It is not just an entryway into heaven. It is a ruling position that he has brought us into. That God, whatever he's doing right now, is echoing into an eternal perspective that he has. So God's pleasure, everything that he has, all of these riches, he is wanting to give you this kingdom. Many of us, when we look at this problem, we're not looking at kingdom. I'm not looking at what God's doing. I'm not looking at eternity. I'm looking at this cancer and I'm saying, I want this gone. I don't want to carry this anymore. It leads to the third point. You can write this down as well. The third point, I worded it like this because it just sticks in my head. God does not give trinkets. He gives a kingdom. I can ask that God take away cancer. That, to me, is not a trinket. But if you really get down to it, he can cure me of cancer. He can do what I ask, only for me to die 5 years from now with heart disease. I can ask him to take away the heart disease, and 5 years down the road, well, now there's kidney failure. You can solve one problem after the other, but God is going to take you from the land of the dying and move you into the land of the living. We have no idea the full size and scale and scope of God's kingdom that he is bringing with good pleasure to you. We miss that all day long when we are fixated on our problem. He does not give trinkets. He does not give little things. When you're looking at the problem and saying it doesn't seem like he's moving, God is not going to do something little. He is going to do something big. It doesn't matter what that problem is. It doesn't matter what you brought. Your life is of greater value and consequence. He has an eternal perspective on that has never gone away. He knew when it was coming into your life. He knows when it's going to leave. He knows how he's going to redeem. He knows how he is going to bless. And the scripture says it is his good pleasure to leverage the full weight of heaven to bring that kingdom to you. Do you believe that in the midst of your anxiety? I admit it's a bit of a struggle for us to see that in the midst of the darkness. But I want to show you an image that I think will help us understand that truth. It's the very reason really why this room is as dark as it is. It's a little different even for me looking out. But here's a famous image that you may recognize very easily. This is a painting from Michelangelo. Michelangelo was born in 1475, so we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years old. He's one of the most famous artists that have ever lived, and we still talk about him. I'm not an art person, but I know his name. And this is something extremely famous. You'll see it scaled, and it is in art galleries, pictures of this, because it's considered a masterpiece. When we're looking at our problem, this is what we're looking at right here. We're looking at this piece of artwork. God is looking and working something else out that you are not seeing in this picture. It is true that this picture is something that is world-renowned, has been talked through for hundreds of years, that we are familiar with the artist. This is an incredible piece of art, beyond value. So what do we do with that? If that's our focus, let's zoom out for 1 second. We are only seeing part of the bigger picture. Here's that. This is also considered a masterpiece. Michelangelo, we take one part and we say, look at the masterpiece of that, and it is world famous, and people are still talking about it. And here we have an even bigger picture. It's hard for us to move out of this realm of our problem when we're fixated on that. But God is saying that it is His good pleasure to bring a kingdom. You may think, okay, the hands reaching out to one another, it's part of a bigger picture. I get that. Let me take you on the full zoom out, and you can see the fullness of this artwork. If you're looking at that, it's going to be right in the middle. This is called the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo painted this entire thing, and it is an absolute amazing work of art. Now, I showed you the one part where they're touching or about to touch the two fingers. The bottom line is we are so fixated on one problem of our life that we literally miss the size and scale and scope of the masterpiece that God is bringing about through that problem. It is hard for us to fathom. We are so focused on, God, I need you to get this out of my life. I am so worried about this that all we're not seeing the full scale of God's kingdom, the full artwork and majesty that He is painting through this. It is one part of a grand plan that God has for you. What is the problem that you brought with you this morning? What is it that God allowed to walk into your life that you are now having to think through your anxiety? It bothers you because you feel like you are completely helpless and vulnerable in this problem. And God is reminding you today, what has anxiety actually got to do with that problem? Nothing. He's reminding you also that He's working in it. You need to ask, reframe the question, what are you doing here, God? Because I know it's a masterpiece. I know that your design and your purpose is a kingdom. God's not going to give me a trinket. He's not going to solve one little problem to make me feel good. He is working on an eternal scale, the likes of which I do not know. But I know that He's doing that in my life. I believe that God brought you here this morning and even online in order to remind you of the truth that He did not design you to walk through your life filled with anxiety. Rather, He is inviting you to turn your attention to Him. He knows your need, and His design is to give you a kingdom. He is going to work through that problem. And maybe those are the exact words that He wanted ringing in your ear as you leave today, that God is in control. He knows, and He's going to develop a masterpiece. He's already got it planned. Whatever this problem is that you brought with you today, what I'm going to ask in our time, really what we call our time of invitation, is really you do business with God. You recognize your anxiety doesn't add a single hour to your life, doesn't lift any of the problems of our life, doesn't do anything for us. But God's working in this, and there is something He's teaching you. There's someone He is reaching. There is something He is doing through it. What is that? But I also know that God is going to deliver. And He's going to deliver a masterpiece, the likes of which I can't fathom when I'm focused on this problem. God invites you today to give that problem to Him. And that we give it over to Him and say, Lord, I'm ready for this masterpiece. I know you're doing that, but I'm going to take my eyes off of this problem, so fixated, because I know that you're in control and I'm not. What gives me the anxiety is knowing that I can't fix this. But I'm not going to be anxious because I know you can. Maybe we just need a little time in prayer that we can name that problem and say, God, this really truly is yours. I'm not going to carry this because I can't carry it anymore. I'm tired of it. I want to see you move, and I want to rest in your goodness. And Lord, I want to see your kingdom. And that's the prayer that we offer today. What I'm going to ask is if you would stand with me. We're going to sing a song. You do business as God leads. If there's something I can do for you, I'd be happy to. I'm so glad that God brought you here. But it is no accident that you're here. What is it that you need to give to the Lord today?
Our scars are a sign of grace in our lives. And Father, how you brought us through. this be our song. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. Weeping may come, remain for a night, but joy will paint the morning sky. You're there in the fast, you're there in the feast. Your faithfulness will always shine. Now every blessing still to come. Let this be our song. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul.
Thank you. You may be seated. So glad that you're with us today. If you're our guest, I am especially delighted that you're here. As mentioned earlier, if there is anything we can do for you, email pastor@southcliff.com. If there's questions, things we can pray with you about, please let us know. I mentioned also, as you make your way out and to the left, there's a place called Connection Corner. I'm going to go there in just a second. If you're our guest, I would love to meet with you. If there's something I can do for you, man, I would just love to be there. There's going to be another team there as well. So come get to know us so we can get to know you. At this time, this is when we do our offering as well. You'll see on the screen a variety of ways in which you can give. If you're in the building and you walk out the doors, you'll see little drop boxes by the doors. Sometimes it's fun as executive pastor. I've mentioned it frequently, but I wish you could sit behind my desk sometimes and see the things that Southcliff is able to do. This past week, we were able to help with needs of one of our widows. We were able to help with some other needs in our church. And that's often through this particular thing called Acts of Grace. It's like our benevolence. Your general budget goes to reach people all over the world. Parts of that we split off. We've got a team that just came back from Taiwan. Tomorrow, our youth are about to go to camp. A couple of weeks ago, our children returned. We have stuff going on all the time right now over the summer. And it's because of your generosity and your giving that is possible. And I want to say thank you for that. It puts a smile on my face every time I get to review these things. I wish you got to see all the good things that you are making happen, not me. I just kind of look over it, but it's you that are making that happen. So thank you so much. I want to invite Stu Kokenauer, or I should say Dr. Kokenauer, our missions pastor, share pastor. He's going to share a few things with us. He assures me he's not jet lagged anymore, so if you have complex questions, please ask him.
We arrived yesterday evening, and so according to my body clock, it is 11:37 p.m., so I'm good for another half an hour, and then I'm going to be calling it. So check with me after the next service. Thank you for your prayers. Gosh, we spent almost 2 weeks in Taiwan. 6 vacation Bible schools, right? That's a lot. 6 vacation Bible schools. And the main one we did, we had, well, actually both of them, we had around 60 children. But at the main one we did, sponsored by Hope Church, a church that was planted by our mission partners, Taiwan, that your offerings go to. Over half of the children were from, not from the church, but were from Buddhist homes. That this was the very first exposure to Jesus that these families have. I've got 3 slides to show you. Let me show you the first one. It's actually in front of our hotel toward the end of the week.
Wow, I'm always amazed how God has timed a message to be part of your life. In fact, if this service meant something to you, do me a favor, share it with others, like it on social media if you happen to be watching it there, but also email pastor@southcliff.com. We'd like to hear from you, encourage you, pray with you, and see how God is moving directly in your life. See you next week online.